So here in Canada, our government likes to force us to watch terrible Canadian TV shows. Even though Canadians would much prefer to just watch American TV, there are actually laws on the books that force Canadian TV channels to show a certain number of Canadian TV shows every day. So if you're a Canadian, you really can't escape them. Canadian adults complain about this a lot, but when you're a Canadian kid, you don't really understand it. You probably noticed that some of the Saturday morning cartoons are inexplicably worse than the other ones, but you just still watch them all anyway because you're a dumb kid who can't entertain himself. Here are 5 dumb Canadian cartoons that I grew up watching as a young Canadian. The first is The Raccoons, which is this really lame show about a bunch of raccoons. Maybe I'm just personally biased against this one because where I grew up there was a lot of real raccoons, which were always getting into the garbage and causing problems, so I do not have a lot of natural affinity for the animal. So anyway, in the show there was this one wacky boy raccoon and he had this red shirt, and then there were these 2 boring other raccoons who were like his siblings or something. And they lived in the scenic Canadian wilderness, which was of course under attack by one of those stereotypical 90s villains who just wanted to pollute and make money. His name was Cyril Sneer, which I can remember because he was the only interesting character on the show. Although these days a lot of people will say that he was actually just kind of an anti-Semitic caricature in retrospect. Even as a kid, I remember thinking that part of the reason the show was so boring was because it was so badly paced. Like, all the dialogue was really badly written and the characters were very stiff and no one had any natural chemistry. None of the jokes were funny, and all of like the action and slapstick was really awkward. It also had this really awful elevator music soundtrack, which only made everything even more sleep-inducing.
Not the falling I'm worried about. It's the landing.
I can see a light shining in the night from you. Somewhere in the dark.
The best way I can describe it is sort of like Teddy Ruxpin, but without the edge. I know some Canadians pretend to have warm memories of this show because it was on all the time, but no, it was terrible. I give it 0 stars. Cartoon number 2 is Sticking Around. Now this one originally began as just a series of little animated sketches that they would show in the time between other shows, but then someone got the idea to adapt those shorts into a full-length series of their own, and Sticking Around was born. So this was a very badly animated stickman-based show about a bunch of latchkey kids from various dysfunctional homes. The main character was Bradley, and he had a friend named Stacy, and they both really hated each other. This was basically the central premise of the show. It was one of those kids shows where the main characters are always having imagination adventures to disguise the fact that the writers can't come up with good storylines set in their actual world. All the characters in Sticking Around had like exactly one personality trait and exactly one catchphrase, which were then repeated ad nauseum. So Stacy would always be like,
For your big fat information.
and Bradley would always be like,
Aliens from Uranus.
and then there were like 2 bullies and this other character who always talked really loudly, and I think that was about it. Canadian cartoons often don't have a lot of characters in order to save money on the animation. The one thing I did think was kind of clever about this show was this one very dark running gag they had about one of the characters. She was the sister of one of the bullies, and she was in a great deal of denial over the fact that her dog was dead. She would drag the dog's corpse around with her everywhere, and everyone had to play along so she wouldn't cry. I give it 0 stars. Number 3 is another gimmickly animated show called Anaconda. This one was done in a sort of South Park collage style where everyone had the faces of old yearbook photos. Personally, I think this idea was done a lot better and a lot funnier in the old Mrs. Munger's Class and Centerville sketches on the old Disney's One Saturday Morning, but that's just me. So anyway, you have the main character named Angela and her best friend named Johnny, and they're like in the 3rd grade or something, and they really hate this other girl named Nanette. Nanette is this big snob and tattletale who is always trying to ruin their fun. Angela and Johnny are both really odd, and I think poor, so you're supposed to sympathize with them as the underdogs. Oh yeah, and they also have a third friend who is like this fat girl, whose name I don't remember. In those days, it was more acceptable to have a lot of humor at the expense of people who were just fat. The big thing about this show, other than the weird animation style, was that everybody spoke in this very affected, mannered way. Like, they would use too many words and sort of over-explain everything. Here, let me show you.
Unless I'm mistaken, which I most seriously doubt, I believe the sentence should read, Bob and I love hot chocolate, or perhaps you're keeping something from us, Angela Anaconda.
I am never going to live this down, on account of nobody ever forgets anything, and they will never let me forget it.
This might be charming at first, but it becomes grating very quickly and makes it difficult to relate to the characters as actual humans instead of just these grotesque puppet things. I give it 0 stars. Number 4 is Ned's Newt. So in this one, which had no particular animation gimmick but was just very badly drawn, you had this kid named Ned, and he fed his Newt some special Newt food, and he turned into this big chatty Newt monster. And the Newt monster was basically just a ripoff of the genie from Aladdin. He was always cracking wise and turning into different things, and even had a Robin Williams style voice.
Nettie, my sole purpose in life is to amuse you. I'll just go out there and I'll give it 110%. Adrian! All right then, Ned, from the top.
God, I'm getting tired of remembering these. 0 stars. And lastly, we have Reboot. No, I'm just kidding. Reboot was a great show. Unlike Monster by Mistake, which was god-awful. As you may recall, there was a time in the late 1990s when computer animation was still this hot new thing, and everyone was trying to churn out CGI animated shows to capitalize on the success of like Toy Story and Shrek. Well, Canada got Monster by Mistake. I really remember very little about this show because even as a kid, I remember thinking it was too lame to watch. It was one of those shows that you only ever really caught the last 5 minutes of because it was on before something better. So there was a kid and his sister, and they had like a ghost friend, and the kid was magical for some reason. I think he had like a curse on him or something. And every time he would sneeze, he would turn into this big blue monster, which of course they had to keep a secret from everyone. This was a very weak premise because it required them to always be getting into situations where things would be causing the boy to sneeze, and there just aren't that many of those. So it would always be like, oh, the class is going to the pepper factory or something. No, actually that would never happen because that would require animating a whole classroom of kids, and I think this show only had like 5 characters in all. Anyway, it was terrible. 0 stars. If you are a Canadian like me, I would like to hear your nomination for the worst Canadian cartoon show that you can remember. And even if you're not Canadian, I'm sure some terrible Canadian cartoons still made their way to you anyway. In fact, a good rule of thumb is this. If you remember a really unfunny, badly animated show, and you've always been wondering why it was so bad and unfunny, chances are it was probably Canadian.